We are in conversation with the top management of ENIL. Prashant Pandey joins us to give us a sense of what exactly is happening in the world of radio. They recently also came out with the annual report in which they made some bit of positive commentary in terms of the landscape. Good morning, Prashant. Thanks so much for speaking to Bloomberg Quint. The trend that we've seen and what everyone wants to know is what's happening on the competitive front, because recently and of late a lot of these online services or apps have come out. You know, it could be a Ghana or it could be a Spotify. How big of a competition is that, and how do you see them impacting your business currently?
You know, I'm happy that you raised this question about competitive landscape, and this is something that really concerns mostly people like you who keep asking me this question every single time. Well, the reality is that while those services are definitely growing, they are creating their own space in the media landscape. They are not affecting FM radio at all. And as evidence of that, let me just point out the latest IRS results to you. And FM radio has grown by 8% since the last time the IRS came out, which was a year back. So FM radio is growing strongly in the country, and it is not impacted negatively by the growth of online digital services.
Okay. The other question obviously relates to competition also, with the number of radio channels also growing significantly. How is that competitive scenario playing out? What are you doing different so that people stick to your channel and not move around? Because the general trend is, even when I'm driving my car, it doesn't depend, it's not a single station. Wherever there are good songs playing, I could just switch onto that. So there's no loyalty as such. So what are you doing in terms of garnering this market share here?
No, I'm sorry, I have to completely disagree with you. First and foremost, the competitive landscape in radio has not become any worse. It's the same number of radio stations today as there were for the last 7 years or so, because there have been no new licenses, no new auctions at all over here, right? That's the first thing. The second thing that you touched upon is the loyalty factor. I'm sorry, I again very strongly disagree with you, because research will show to you that all radio stations pretty much retain their listenership base. And for instance, in the last 1 year since the last IRS has come out, Radio Mirchi has grown very strongly compared to last year, and therefore it retains its base and it grows on top of that. What you are referring to is the concept of consideration set. And when you are in the car typically, or when you're listening to radio on the mobile phone, for example, you certainly switch between radio stations just as much as you switch between television stations, and you also switch between other newspapers. There is no difference over there. But in radio, actually stickiness is even higher, because the consideration set is actually much smaller.
The other part I wanted to ask you, Prashant, was on this royalty factor, because a couple of notes have come out indicating that the royalty probably from some of these music labels is expected to go up. Can you just brief us on what this scenario is? How much royalty do you all pay, and is that expected to go up? Is there a cap that's expected? Just to understand what exactly is happening.
Well, the reason you may be hearing a few stories about royalty now is because the radio royalty order, which had come out in 2010, which had been given by the Copyright Board, was a 10-year order. And I think sometime around August, September next year in 2020 is when the 10-year period lapses. And therefore, either the order will get extended or a new order will come out by next year. And maybe that's the reason why you may have heard about this matter. But in all honesty, nothing in the environment has changed, and I don't expect any significant change in the royalty regime in the country in the next order when it comes out. The other reason that you may be hearing about royalties, because with respect to streaming services, there is a pretty extensive debate happening amongst music companies and digital services about what the royalty should be, and that subject is getting focused now.
What about international market? Obviously, you've had a lot of tie-up, especially in markets of US, Middle East. What's your strategy to grow there? How are you looking to tap this market even further?
You know, the way we look at it is that we have a strong radio business, and we have a very, very, very strong brand. And anywhere in the world you travel, and I'm talking about countries where there aren't too many Indians really living in large pockets. If you go to a Frankfurt, for instance, or any of those kind of places, you meet any Indian over there and you'll find that there is a huge need that they have for Indian content. And when we tell them about Mirchi, then they all get very excited and say, hey, when are you guys launching? In fact, in the US, before we launched, we have been testing that market for quite some time. And every time we would get the same thing saying that you guys keep talking, but you never launch. Now we have launched in the tri-state area, which is New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. And we are also available, the brand is available in 8 other cities, and including big ones like Atlanta and Philadelphia and all the others. So, the response is tremendous. In fact, now the feedback that we're getting from the other cities in the US, especially on the West Coast, is that when are you guys launching over here? So there is a huge pull for the brand, which got us to launch in the US. Now in the Middle East, it's a very interesting story. We launched in the UAE 7 years back. And in, I think, about 4 or 5 years of being there in that country, we emerged as the #1 radio brand in the UAE. Now, when I say #1, I'm cutting across languages. So we are bigger than Arabic. We are bigger than all the Hindi radio stations that existed for the last 20 years. Again, that is symbolic of the kind of pull that the brand has. Now, our strategy is very simple. If the brand has so much pull, then let's take the brand wherever it needs to go. And therefore, you will see us expanding into many more countries. We are exploring all formats. It is not FM or AM only. It could be HD radio. It could be digital. It could be various other platforms that are now available globally. So the brand has huge traction, and we are just tapping that.
As per the annual report, what you've also said is that, as the brand becomes much more mature, the profitability in the international concert business will also improve. What's your strategy there? Because somehow that hasn't picked up as much as the street would have liked.
Well, to be honest, we did 2 international artists concerts last year, and we lost money on both of them. And in all honesty, it wasn't a great experience. But, we did it for the first time, and we learned our lessons. We now know that it needs a lot more planning. It needs a lot more lead time. And, we rushed into it last year. So we learned our lessons. Now, we certainly will do more concerts featuring international artists, but we will do it when we are ready to do it. And I don't see an international artist happening this year at least. Maybe in the coming year, we will look at it. So, yeah, that's the reality.
What's the strategy for growing your core radio business as well as your solutions business? What have you planned that these 2 segments grow significantly?
Well, the radio business is facing certain structural challenges. Again, let me be honest on this subject. As much as the television business is facing, or the newspaper business is facing, or the out-of-home business is facing, in that there is advertiser interest which is increasing towards the digital business and towards the on-ground and event businesses, and there is relatively a more tepid traction for the traditional businesses. So that is one structural factor that affects core radio. The other factor that affects core radio, of course, is that there is no expansion possible. There are no new stations coming up in the big cities. There is not enough inventory left, advertising inventory left that you can sell. And given the overall macroeconomic conditions, it is not that pricing is growing very strongly. In fact, pricing is under severe pressure at this point in time. So structurally, the core radio business has been under pressure for some time and will remain under pressure even going forward. And which is why the solutions business is so clearly a strategic move that is so important for ENIL. And it's not something that we have started now. It's been going on for the last 10 years. But over the last 3 or 4 years, it has really become a sizable component. In fact, last year, the solution business was 1/3 of the total business, which is pretty significant. And I expect it to become close to 1/2 of the business in the next 4 or 5 years. And the solutions business is actually growing very fast because clients are now saying that they're not interested in buying just media. They want solutions. They are focused on their business problems, and they want media partners who can provide solutions to them. And that business is what we are focused on as well.
Prashant, the other part is the digital business. In your annual report, you've indicated that that's the strategy where you see business really coming in. If I'm not wrong, one of the reports indicated that it will grow from 10 crores to in excess of 75 crores. Is that what the management expects? What's your strategy here? Why are you seeing so much growth coming in, and how is this going to be possible?
Well, there are two parts to the digital story. One is the revenue piece, and I will come to that in a moment. And two is the profit piece or the loss piece, which also I will come to in a moment. First, let me talk about the revenue piece. Now, the revenue piece is the reason I'm so confident about the digital business growing is because we have a suite of products that we have created over the last 3 or 4 years, which is finding a lot of traction in the market. We use our social media footprint that we have as a brand and as 150 radio jockeys that we have. The combined footprint of our social media is upwards of 18 million followers on Facebook, right? Then we are very strong on videos, and it's a very surprising thing that a radio company can be so strong on videos. But again, remember that my programming team is so talented that they can do a lot more than just audio or radio. And when we put our content on YouTube last year, we've generated more than 725 million views. Now, these are very, very big numbers, and I see them growing very rapidly. Also, strategically, 3 years back, we started the shift towards embracing digital in a bigger way. And the whole programming team now has KRAs and KPIs, which are based on how their digital work does, in addition to how their radio work does, right? So the focus on digital started 3 years back, and we are now finding a lot of traction amongst clients. We have developed products which are selling in the market, and that's why I'm confident that we will hit a 75 crore kind of a number in the next few years. Now, coming to the business part of it, the beauty about the whole creative team that works in ENIL is that they are actually there for the radio business, and the radio business is already profitable. It is taking care of all the costs that are attached to this team, the overheads, the salaries, the entire equipment that is required. All of that is already taken care of by the radio business. What we are doing on the digital side actually comes at an incremental cost, and that is why the digital business for ENIL almost broke even last year, and in the next 5 years I see it hitting the same profit margin as the radio business does. And that's something that is unique for Radio Mirchi. Most standalone digital businesses will continue to face losses, but for a business like radio, when it extends into digital, that's going to be profitable.
A couple of more questions. A lot of the other radio channels have actually raised their advertising prices. Is that something that Radio Mirchi has also done, and if yes, by how much?
Well, the brutal honesty is that there is nobody who has been able to raise prices.
Okay.
In fact, all these announcements are just paper announcements. They mean nothing, and we stopped doing these announcements many years back. The reality is that Radio Mirchi has more or less retained its pricing in the market compared to a year ago, while all other radio stations, mostly all other radio stations, have been forced to lose pricing, some between 5% and 10%. But the radio pricing, the pricing in the market, whether it is radio, whether it is TV, whether it is print, is under pressure.
Are the phase 3 radio stations that you got gaining traction now? Do you see them becoming operationally EBITDA positive anytime soon?
Well, in phase 3, as you know, there are 2 batches. Batch 1, we had 17 stations, the bigger ones, and batch 2, we had 21 stations, relatively the smaller towns. Batch 1 became profitable long back, in fact, within the first 6 quarters of their being operational. Batch 2 stations as a bulk are still loss-making because they are just about 2 or 3 quarters old. And I think by the time that they also get to their 6th quarter mark, I think they will also turn EBITDA positive. Meanwhile, batch 1 stations are doing pretty well. Revenue growth is robust, margin improvement is also robust, and I think give it another year or 2 and they will hit the kind of EBITDA margins that our mature stations are working at.
What about the smaller towns? Because if we saw the auctions and all, the demand pretty much wasn't there in some of the smaller towns. Is that a matter of concern that you have, that here is a market that you potentially could tap, but it's somehow not getting tapped?
Well, it should be a matter of concern for the government, because think about it, many of these smaller markets, I mean, I give this example of a city called Satna in Madhya Pradesh. It may have a population of 3 lakhs or 4 lakh people, and 3 lakh or 4 lakh people are being deprived of the benefits of a private radio station, right? So that's a huge loss that the government should be concerned with, the public interest loss. For Radio Mirchi, even if it had acquired Satna, it would have probably contributed 75 lakh rupees or 1 crore rupee in a full year in terms of revenue. So it's really not a big deal for a company which did 620 crores of revenue last year. So the loss to ENIL or the loss of opportunity to ENIL is very limited, but the government has to be concerned that it is depriving so many people. And I think there were more than 100 cities that the government put up in batch 2 auctions, and I think most of them could not attract bidders. And the government has to think why that happened. And it did not happen because the demand is less. It happened because the government has a very flawed auction policy. It has very high reserve fees, and then it has an auction methodology that can only increase the bidding amount from the reserve fee. This is not going to happen in cities like Satna and maybe 100 other cities. What the government has to do is it has to reduce reserve fees very, very drastically, and then start the auction process. And then it will find that there is demand, all the bidders will be back on the table, the government will be able to sell off all the licenses, hundreds of millions of people will suddenly be able to listen to private FM radio. I think the government is making a mistake in its auction methodology.
Okay, and my last question, probably not as a business, but as someone who listens to radio, how are you differentiating your product offering? Because overall, everyone offers, the other radio channels also pretty much offer a similar kind of services, similar kind of songs. So what should one radio fan do so that they stick to Radio Mirchi?
Well, that's absolutely not true at all. And, that is the fact is that every station is different, and that is why they have loyal followers. We, for instance, in Mirchi play contemporary music, but when we have a second station like Mirchi Love, for instance, we are playing much more soothing, melodious music, and that sounds totally different from Mirchi. If you take the city of Mumbai or Delhi, for instance, there are so many radio stations. There are a couple of retro Hindi music stations. There is a radio station which plays mostly 1990s music. There is an English radio station. And that's one part of it, where the music actually is quite different for all the radio stations. But the other part is that the personalities are completely different. If you look at a Radio Mirchi, the personality that we have on Radio Mirchi is a very sunshine channel. It's a happy channel. It will always put the listener at ease and make the listener feel very happy. But there is another channel, for instance, which will take everybody to task, right? It will take the municipality to task. It will take the citizens to task. It will take whatever to task. But that gives you a very good experience, but a very different experience. So like that, there are different radio stations, and I don't think that this is a fair statement to make that they all are about the same or they're not. They are very, very different. They're different brands, and consumers also appreciate that fact.
Okay, Prashant, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for speaking to Bloomberg Quint, and all the best for the months going ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How many places